Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1350. Aleph Shin Nun. And we began the second side of the story as everything works from the top down. So in simple English, we talked about the process that we, the human being on earth, as a yesh, as a person of material substance, of ego, of self, identity, an independent consciousness, works their way toward recognizing, becoming aware of higher consciousness, and ultimately the consciousness of godliness, and climbs the ladder step by step by step. Generally, that is prayer. And as we refine ourselves, we become more and more containers, not just for our own expressions and indulgences, but containers for the transcendent divine purpose for which we were created. But the other half of an interface is, what is the perspective of our partner, God? This is our perspective. So it's true, we are turning toward our partner, toward godliness, toward divine. But what is the perspective from the top down? And that's what Torah gives us a picture of, essentially God's vision. So though we have some extent, we can figure it out also from ourselves, but it's nothing like getting the actual blueprint, the actual mandate. And the Torah, as we shall discuss, what Torah exactly is, but we know that Torah is God's wisdom. That's where he embodied his whole plan, his vision, everything is there in the Torah. That's why the Torah is such a vital component. And that he calls Amshacham Umayla Lamata, Ma'ayin Liyesh. There we're working from the sublime, divine sublime, towards substance, toward yesh, toward identity. So essentially it's divine consciousness that's informing human consciousness, in contrast to human consciousness becoming aware of divine consciousness. Or to use the words that we learned earlier, that the post-Simpson reality of existence after the divine was concealed, Elokim, comes to recognize that Havayu Elokim, v'yadaita hayom, v'ashavesa levavecha, we come to recognize that the divine, the godliness that's really beyond the concealment, but it's coming through concealment. Whereas when you speak from the point of view of Torah, we're talking about getting the picture of before the Tzimtzum, the light before the Tzimtzum, informing the reality after the Tzimtzum, what it's like. So it's a very different perspective. So both of them obviously meet, but one is coming from a state of following concealment and connecting to that which is beyond the concealment and higher than the concealment, the divine revelation. And the Torah is coming from revelation into the concealment. So he called that Ma'ayin Liyesh, because Torah is the level of Ma'av Chachma, which is Ayin. It's a sublime, it's not about an ego, it's not about an identity, it's about it's reflecting the divine wisdom, the divine plan. And the root, that's Chochma Gduma Da'ak, which is the Etzem, the Atzmis of Shema. So not just Shema as it manifests an expression, but also its very core, Ayin Atzmi, and Amshacham Amayla Lamata, from that this comes down, Shanasa B'chinis Mitzias, that the Torah, that this Ayin comes into substance, into a tangible reality from this sublime state, Ma'ayin Liyesh, that the Ayin Atzmi, Hu Sha'ayin Atzmi B'chinis Yesha Mitzias. So we read the first four lines on page 1350. And as I said, this is coming in direct contrast, or you can say the second part of the story, after the hundreds and hundreds of pages that we talked about through the Torah of the Magid, is the two halves, but from the perspective from below, after the Tzimtzumim, how we elevate through prayer. And we start from a state of darkness, chashchus, like he said, and there we come to a state of passion. But we don't begin with the passion. We don't begin with revelation. We begin with concealment. Now, we're talking about from the top down. Okay, so we're going to continue learning now. So we're on the fifth line, page 1350. You can follow along if you want to follow the text, ayinbeis.com, which is really just takes you to chassidusapplied.com, but the section on Ayin Beis. Okay. So, ubir inyan, and the explanation of this is, and this is going to set the tone. This is going back to the style of Ayin Beis. He begins with a general topic, asks questions, and then begins explaining it. And we'll come back to this verse that he's going to be. The operative verse he's going to use now is a verse we already used earlier in Ayin Beis, but now he's using it in the context of Torah, and that's the famous pasuk, Ner Mitzvah v'Torah Eir. Which means the flame of a mitzvah and the light of Torah, or the candle of a mitzvah and the light of Torah. The derech chaim techachas musa is the third part of the verse, but he's not going to refer to that. That was discussed actually in volume 2, that the path of life is musa, is actually coming from a state of darkness. But the first part is light, ner mitzvah v'Torah eir. That's going to be the verse, and he's going to come back to this, if I recall, almost till the end of Ayin Beis. This is going to be used, it's going to come back to it more than once. Ner mitzvah v'Torah eir. So keep that in mind. Yeah. I see all the way, even page 1466, which is close to the end, he comes back to it. So he says, explanation of this inyan. Now it says, Kiner mitzvah, because the mitzvah is a flame, a candle, the Torah eir. And Torah is light, the light of Torah. Sha mitzvah nikne ner. Mitzvah is called a candle, a ner, a flame, a candle. But Torah he b'chinas eir. And Torah we use the word eir. So of course you could ask right away, what's the difference between the two? Both of them give off light, but clearly ner and eir are not the same level of light. So he's going to discuss the difference between the two, and with that we'll understand what Torah is. Okay. Uksiv, another pasuk where the idea of a flame is used. Ner Hashem nishmas adam. Another place, flame, the flame of God is the soul of a human being. So here again we see the word ner. Harigam aneshama nikra ner. So just like mitzvah is called a flame, a candle, aneshama is also called a candle. But tzarich lahavin, and we need to understand mahu ner the neshama v'ner the mitzvah. What is this ner of neshama and what is this ner of mitzvah? What is the candle of a neshama and what is the candle of a mitzvah? So we have not just understand the difference, but also what exactly is that? What are we referring to? Why is the verse using that example of a flame or a candle? Gam tzarich lahavin. Additionally, we need to understand, because it was explained earlier, the b'chinas mada adam lamayla, that the likeness of man above, which is we're talking about the vision of Yecheskel, the vision of seeing the likeness of a man, which is referring to the 10 spheres of Atzilus, as they manifest below. So they look like a man. What means a man? Not a physical man. It means that we were created in the divine image. So it's a structure. It's the structure of it's called the archetype, the human archetype in the likeness of man. So explained earlier that Adam Lamaila, that likeness of man that we see that's above, on the kisei, on the throne, Zeu Mashe Yisrael Ola b'machshava. So you can recall, he said that's the level that Yisrael Ola b'machshava. This was stated twice. Let's just refer to it right here. Where was it? On page, I think it was the bottom. Yeah, on page 1347, closer to the bottom, he says, Yisrael Ola machshava. So when we say the likeness of man, it means God envisioning what the human being, that envisioning is the likeness of man. It's a vision. It's an image. It's like a father envisioning what his child will look like. So we're not talking about just the superficial look. We're talking about the personality, the character, the makeup, the components and elements that will comprise a human being, that a human being is comprised of. So that's the Yisrael Ola b'machshava. So that's what we learned earlier. So based on that, he's saying, the divine energy on its own, before this envisioning, that before he arose in his thought, Yisrael, so the Ein Sof on its own, hu b'chinas kilei Adam hu. It's a level that transcends Adam. There's a verse that says he is not a human. God doesn't have any relationship to anything that's human. He's not in the image of a human. He's lo Adam hu. He's beyond Adam. And here we say Mara Adam Lamaila, the likeness of man. So what does that mean? So he says Vahainu, which means Shagama Erva Gili Memenius Baruch. That means that also the light and energy that radiates from God to the worlds, who bechinas lo Adam adayin, is still not yet shaped, even though it's already an energy that God is applying to enter and create and sustain existence. But on its own, it's an air pashut. It's a shapeless ayat. It's shapeless and seamless. Being that it's a revelation from the core. It's true, it's a revelation that it's already associating with and is going to radiate in the world, but it's not yet assumed. If you recall, we learned the levels before. It says Yisrael Olu b'machshava means Olu. It arose in his thought. That means there was a level before it arose in his thought, conceptually, not in time. So that's gilim and etzem. And just like the etzem is shapeless and not defined by structure, like we think of it, the artist, before he begins to envision art, he's not in any form or shape. And this is even higher. It's like the etzem. But then comes the next level of Iraq. It's only due to the fact, in other words, Eir on its own doesn't have any likeness of man, any image. It's only because Yisrael Olam Machshava that Yisrael, the Jewish shamas of this Israel, arose in his thought. So now, once God is conscious and consciously focusing on Yisrael, because that's the purpose of all existence and creation, like we learned earlier. So now an image begins to emerge, so to speak, like the shape and image of a child that is engraved in the thought of a father, of a parent, of a father. So even before the child is born, as a parent, you imagine, what is my child going to look like? So there's a state before that imagination or before that thought. That's Ein Sof on its own. That's called Lo Adam. And then there comes a state where it manifests in an image. Like we learned earlier, and I mentioned this a number of times in volume 2, he spoke about this at length. And I'll tell you where it was. It was on, I believe, the whole topic is 896. But specifically, this magid of a father imagining a child is actually explained on page 902. So he starts on 896, and then 902 is where he talks about the ben nechka katsura shel ben, even though the child wasn't born yet. And he explains at length what that means. So what's the point here? Is that there's two states. A state lo yadam, Ein Sof on its own, and then when it begins to envision. Remember, you may recall where we talked about like a home, that a human being is not complete without a home. But that doesn't mean you're envisioning a home just because you're not complete. You have to be conscious of it. So there's a state where it's part of you, but you're not even aware of it. You're not even thinking about it, even to yourself. So he's saying, even the gili, the on its own, is in a state of lo yadam. But then comes a state where he does envision it. Now, where are we going with all of this? What's the point? Because he's coming to ask something. He's coming to ask a question. So we're going to see what the question is in a moment. So now we've established that neshamis olav machshava. He says, "Vehine hatayra nikre gamkein adam." We find Torah sometimes also called man. Like it says, Adam. This Torah is Adam. Even though it could be read that this is the Torah about man, but it's also the Torah is compared to Adam. In other words, the Torah also has a structure that parallels the human structure. Pasha tell this. Like he writes in Zohar, the chapter tells us, Daf Kuf Lamed Daled Amud Beis, 134b, Shatera hi b'chinas sir Adam. The Torah comes in the image of an Adam. There's a structure to Torah. Like he explains this in Biuri Hazer, which is most likely the Mittler Rebbe's Biuri Hazer, which is the discourses, the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe on this Zohar, he explains it. So based on that, so in addition to what we asked before about Ner Mitzvah and Ner Neshama, that they're both compared to flame, now he's talking another Tzarech Lahavin. Since we're talking about Torah, that just like Yisrael has something similar to a mitzvah, which is Ner, a flame, and we need to understand that, there's also something similar with Torah. They're both called Adam. So Tzarech Lahavin, Ma Hefresh Lamaila. What is the difference above between Sir Adam, the neshamas, of the image of the likeness and image of man of souls, let's Sir Adam the Torah, to the likeness of image in Torah? An interesting question. But I believe, if I recall correctly, that the Rebbe Rashab never gets back to answer this explicitly. I think we'll be able to extrapolate and derive an answer from the discussion, but I don't think he explicitly answers this. So this is one of the places I pointed out yesterday a number of times that it's good to keep in mind as a clue to know what would have been written had he continued the Hemshech. So let's keep that in mind, the back of our minds. So far, he began Ner Mitzvah Torah Eir. What is the difference between Neshama and what is Ner of Neshama? Neshama is also a candle, like a mitzvah. And the second question is, what is the difference between the Adam, as Neshamas manifest that structure that God envisions, and Torah, that also manifests that structure? Now, I could just say this. I'm only saying this. I usually don't do this. But since he may not spell it out, we already have hints to the answer earlier. If you remember, Neshamas, he's compared to Kalim. On top of page 1349, and earlier as well, he said Neshamas are ultimately come from Kalim, because in Neshama, even though on one hand it's like a flame and a light, because it expresses the divine, but it separates. Like he says in the Ger Sakedesh 20, he says the soul separate from the Kalim of Atzilus because they have to come down below. If they remained light, they would never be able to come into a body and be able to sustain and exist in a physical body down on earth. It always remains a reflection of its source. It's like the light of the sun. So neshamas, even though they're a form of air, but they also come into manifest in Kalim. Torah, on the other hand, Torah is not a ner. It's because Torah always retains the image of the divine. The divine, I should say, not the image. The divine consciousness is always retained in Torah, even when it comes into an Adam. So basically, neshamas would be the tzir of Adam like in Kalim, and neshamas would be the tzir of Adam like in Eir. I'm saying it only because this is something that pretty much was stated, not quite in those words, but that idea was stated earlier. It's okay, but he's going to explain, of course, all of this. Now, next piece. Like I said, the Rebbe Rashab is laying out the groundwork, of which he's going to now develop these ideas at length, and all in the context of what Oir really is. So you could say this section is really about Oir. Till now we learned about Kalim and Ban, Mamata, now we're learning about Oir. Then he goes on and says like this: in order to understand this, we need to first understand Inyan Ner the Neshama v'Ner Mitzvah. He's going back to the first question. What is the Ner, the flame or candle of the soul, and what is the candle of the mitzvah? So he's going to dissect what is a candle exactly. When we say a Ner is Shabbos, the candles, Shabbos candles, or Ner is Chanukah, candles of Chanukah, or the Neris of the Menorah and the Beis Hamikdash. So what does a Ner consist of? Why do we use the word Ner? So he's going to explain a ner is made up of three pieces, three parts. A ner encompasses and includes three things. What are the three? Apsila, the wick, v'hashemen, the fuel, the oil, va'er, and the light that it produces. If you're lacking one of those three things, you're not going to have a candle. If you have oil without the wick, you're not going to have oil. You need the wick, but you need the shemen, the fuel. So if you take one of the three, you're never going to have even two of the three. You need all three to produce the flame of a candle. So the wick, the fuel, the oil, and the oil that it produces the light. Because you could also have psila and shemen. If you don't light it, it remains standing. You have a psila, and you won't have oil either if you don't have oil. And if you have oil and no psila, again, the same thing. And the oil, the light, which is contained by, is bound by nechaz, it holds on to dafke in the wick. So in other words, if you have oil, you can try to light oil, it'll burn out very quickly, or it won't catch altogether. So the flame, if you see, the wick is feeding the wick. I'm sorry, the fuel is feeding the wick. It draws the oil into the wick, and with that feeds the flame. So the flame has something to hold on to. Take away the wick, and the flame will expire, will disappear. Raksha psila levad. On the other hand, the wick alone, if you only had a wick and you lit it and there was no shemen and no oil, it would immediately burn out. It would light for a second, it would burn out because it doesn't have any fuel feeding it. So it would burn, nisref would burn, v'nichla, and extinguish immediately. And also the light wouldn't shine, it wouldn't light, you wouldn't have air that would be shining and lighting, illuminating. By Yidei Hashemen, through the oil, the fuel, nimshach hapsilas man rav. That causes the wick to last for a long time. Obviously, as much as fuel there is there. The eina nichla, and it doesn't expire, it doesn't extinguish. But eru er bahir. And the light is a shining light, a glowing light. So you see how all three pieces are necessary in the process of producing a ner, a flame. And that's how you see. Look at any menorah, just study. You'll see these three things. Va'oz kasher apsilahi b'shemen. Now, when you have the right combination, and the psila, the wick is immersed in the oil, that causes that the psila will not just burn out, it remains moist and it's drawing the fuel. The nichla I'm sorry. Then on the contrary, psila eina nisra v'nichla b'mena rak ma'at mazir. It does not burn and get extinguished. It only goes slowly. It slowly burns because the fuel is feeding it, and it continues to burn for like you said, a long time. So it does. You can't say that the wick is not going to burn out. It just will not happen immediately. The fuel, the shemen, is making sure that the psila lasts as long as possible until the fuel runs out. So it goes very slowly. It burns very slowly until ultimately it will get extinguished. And what's actually happening, that the psila remains intact. The psila actually, till the whole oil and fuel is not depleted, the psila remains completely intact even afterwards. You see the psila remains there. So interestingly, if there was no oil, the wick would burn out. And not only burn out, it would burn up. Whereas now, what's happening is, what is actually burning and slowly being dissolved, or slowly nichla, slowly dissolved is a good word, or absorbed, is the shemen. is the oil, the fuel. The light that's burning is burning as it draws from the oil. And slowly depletes it, slowly. As we see, say a flame will burn a half hour, an hour, hour and a half, whatever the amount is. And now all these details are obviously relevant. This is all an example. He's going to show how all of this is relevant in our avodah, in our work. And that's why he uses the word ner, because he's really dissecting and explaining what is a flame. What is a candle? So we'll see where that goes. And through that, it's a bright, illuminating light. A bright light that's illuminating. Nimtza. So what do we derive from this? What do we draw from this? What do we take from this? That the light that's burning, the burning light burns and depletes or diminishes a machla. Dafke, the oil, not the psila, not the very wick, but the oil. Rakshazeo dafka de psila. But it's happening through the channel of the wick. In other words, it's not just oil and fire, it's fire drawing from the wick, the oil, but the oil is being depleted as we go, as it feeds that flame. The shemen alone, the oil, the fuel alone, is not a container for the fire. Because the air, that the earth should grab onto it and deplete it. Is the psila that's the keli. So you can't call the fuel or the shemen, the oil, a keli. The keli is the wick, but the keli, the wick, is drawing from the oil, which in turn causes the flame. So it's only the psila here, keli ala'ed. V'yodei nisa v'nichla hashemen, ma'at. And through it, the shemen is being depleted. So you have like somewhat of a paradox going on here. The keli for it, you have to have the psila because that's what's actually burning. But what is being depleted is not the wick, it's the oil and the fuel that's being drawn through this wick. So those are the three components and how they interact with each other. V'nimtza, and we derive from this, that psila hi mamutza ben ha'er v'hashemen. So this is another ways of saying that the psila, the wick, is like an interface, a bridge, an intermediary between the flame, the light, and the fuel, the oil. V'hainu, and this means shehi meisheches es hashemen el ha'er. It draws the wick, the physical wick draws the fuel, the oil to the fire, to the flame. B'hainu. Now he adds in the parentheses, I guess, some explanation. I'm not sure what's missing, but let's see. B'hainu, and this means kasher yesh bo er hanechas bo. So the condition here is that the flame has to be able to be grasped and held on to by the psila. I guess he's coming to qualify because you have an elam adlikin in Shabbos. There's some things that are not fitting wicks. You could have excellent oil and fuel, but if the wick, for example, is a very, very thin thread, or the wick is a very thick piece of wet cotton, or some other object, so you could have a wick, but the wick is not really a good keli to the oil. So then you have the oil, the fuel, you can light it, but it's not going to burn properly. So he's saying here that yesh ba'er hanechas ba'harihu meisheches es hashemen, that the flame has to have something to work with here. It's a psila that's fitting, that the earth can hold on to it, and that's what causes it to draw the fuel properly. If the wick wouldn't be good, let's say the wick is wet, or an object that is not really flammable, or something like that, like a piece of metal, a thin wire or something, a wire is not going to be a proper keli for oil. The masha'ir sheves Hashem idea psila. He's adding a little about the quality of the wick. It looks like, because that the flame draws from the fuel of the oil is through the wick. So the wick has to be the right wick that fits with that oil. And the wick is what draws the flame to the oil, to the fuel, l'sorfe, to burn it, and to consume it. That's a good word, to consume it. Ma'at, slowly. It's a slow process. And that's why the flame burns for a long period of time. And this is what causes the flame to burn, the light to illuminate. Okay. So detailed breakdown of what a ner is. And now he's going to explain what is all this. Before I continue, if anybody wants to ask anything. I think it's pretty clear, the details here. Okay. The yuvan, and the example from this was a mashal, an example. So the example from this, we'll understand from this example, b'ner neshama v'ner mitzvah. In the first point that he made, the neshama is called a ner, a candle, and the mitzvah is called a candle. So this breakdown of the example, he's now going to apply to the metaphor, to the moral rather. The metaphor is going to apply to the moral. What do we learn from this regarding the fact that we use the word candle of a mitzvah and candle of a neshama? Excuse me. So he says, the bekol echad ve'echad yesh gimel inyanim. In each one of these, either he means mitzvah and neshama, or it means in every person. Not sure. The bekol echad ve'echad yesh gimel inyanim has three things. We just talked about three components. So he's now going to explain the three components in each one, either in the mitzvah and the neshama, or in each neshama, or each person. The hine. The ner the neshama apsilahu hanefesh alakis. It looks like he means kol echad ve'echad. He means in both the mitzvah and the neshama. That's how I would explain it. In the ner of the neshama, in the candle of a soul, what is the wick? He says that's the divine soul. The psil is the nefesh alakis. And he's going to bring, as the classically does, that the Rebbe Rashab does, citations and sources in Kabbalah on this topic. So he brings the first from Ma'ira Eir. The Ma'ira Eir, so Ma'ira Eir is from Meir Papirash, who was a great Kabbalist, a student of the Arizal. And I mentioned this book a number of times. He mentioned Ma'ira Eir is written like an encyclopedia in alphabetical order, in Aleph Beis order. So he goes through literally every erech. So there's the erech of ner, of oir, and so on. So Eir is structured by letters. Here we're talking about psila. So an ois pei, psila wick in Hebrew, it starts with a pei. Sif lamed, which means the letter pei, and he has a bunch of different subsections. And in the section 30, he says, Kosav, he writes, psila nikra ha-malchus. The wick is called Malchus. Because Malchus becomes like a wick to grasp and hold on to the light of the Zachar, of the male, of the Mashpia. So when you talk about a union between husband and wife, Malchus is the Makabel, says like a psila that holds on to the oir of the Mashpia of the husband, of the Chosin and Kal. Yeah. So we still have to understand, is that the nefesh alakis? So we'll see. Ubiyar Nesiv is essentially a commentary on Ma'ira Eir. He brings sources. The Ma'ira Eir just tells us what level it is. In Yair Nesiv, he actually explains the sources for each of these levels. So he says that Yair Nesiv b'shem ha-tikunei zeyar, in the name of the Tikunei Zeyar. Tikunei Zeyar, Zeyar, of course, is the classic work of Rav Shimon bar Yochai that was found and discovered in the 15th century and then published. But then they found additional parts, so they call it Tikunei Zeyar. Tikunei Zeyar, literally Tikunei means repairs, or it also means ornaments. But it's essentially an additional component. So Tikunei Zeyar, Tikun Chav Ches. Tikun Chav Ches, and the Rebbe Rashab is correcting that in Yair Nesiv, he says it's in the section called Tikun 28. So it says Tzorech Li is Chav Zayin. In other words, it was a typo. And he says it should be 27, not 28. So what does he say in Tikunei Zeyar? The name of Tikunei Zeyar, Psila do Shechina. The wick is the level called Shechina. The Shechina, the divine presence, which of course is usually the level of Malchus. So that's a source for what the Ma'ir says, that the wick is compared to Malchus. Umash Misham, and from there it appears the Rebbe Rashab is writing, the Psila hi shemislabish u'misachedim akeli. Oh, 1 second here. This looks like a parentheses. I want to see where it goes till. What is this? Oh, the parentheses ends on the first line of the next page. So we're going through a rather lengthy or relatively longer parentheses. So this is all to prove the case that the first of the three components of the candle, the wick, is the divine soul. So he's explaining it by first bringing that the psila is Malchus. Now we know it's Shechina, and the Rebbe Rashab is saying, Umash Misham, it appears from there. There most likely means the Tikunei Zeyar. The psila shemislabish u'misachedim akeli. The psila is the level that manifests and unites with the container, the shom, and there he writes the akeli hu matat. Makeli is matat. Matat is a certain angel that refers to an angel that contains energy. So we have different levels and different names of nesham of malachim. Matat is a level usually referring to Shechina of the Shechina, the malach that relates to the Shechina of Malchus. But it's considered a container because matat manifests in a very defined entity. Earlier we learned in volume 2 when he spoke about matat and sandal. These are different names for malachim. He spoke about the keli of that. So bottom line is, so when we say the psil is the Shechina, he's saying here that the psil manifests and unites with the container. So though Malchus is one of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, and it's a divine presence, it's the Shechina, but it's the Shechina as it's manifesting and connecting with Keli. That's why it's called Psila. Because a wick, as we said, is a mamutza between the oil and the shemen, between the light, the flame, and the fuel. So the wick is like a Keli. And that's the Keli that draws from the fuel that feeds the light. So what is that in above? That's the level of Malchus, the Shechina, which unites with the Keli. And that's why it's called Psila, because Malchus unites b'tachtenim. The other spheres, the 9 spheres, remain in Atzilus. Malchus goes down and becomes the Keser, the crown of Biyah, like we spoke. Malchus is the king, so he's the lowest level of the higher world that becomes the highest level of the next world. So it goes down. So the Shechina, as he says in Tanya, that's why it's called Shechina. We say v'shachanti b'seicham. So even though we have a Kodesh Baruch Hu, God, a Kodesh Baruch Hu is Kodesh Umuvdal. That's the godliness that is not manifesting in an internalized way. Shechina is always referring to the divine as its shechanti, as it dwells below. And that's generally the level of Malchus, which is why it's compared to the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan, because Malchus draws the energy of the divine into the Kelim and into grounded into a world like the Mishkan b'shachanti b'seichem Shechina. Via Shleimer Gam came. This is all the parentheses explaining this level of psila of Wick. And we could say as well, says the Rebbe Rashab, the Malchus ibchinas makabel, the Malchus, in addition to being connected to the Keli because it goes down below, Malchus itself is a state of makabel. Makabel, we know it's a recipient. Like he said, from Ma'ir to Eir, that is the psila that holds on to the Eir, the energy of the mashpia, of the tchura. Like the moon that contains and receives the light of the sun. Because the moon has no light of its own, has nothing of its own. Only that which it receives and contains from that which comes from above it. In this case, Zah or Tchura from the Mashpia, from the sun. Omnom, however, he b'chinas keli haruya lekabel eir. But it's not just a keli. There's a keli that can be also a very crass and very, like we spoke before about a wick like a wire, or a wick that's wet, or a wick that's so thick it can't really hold on to the fire. The keli of Malchus is perfectly balanced to be keli haruya, an appropriate, a fitting container, lekabel eir, to receive the light. Because if it wasn't really a recipient, a proper recipient, it wouldn't receive the light. And that is due to mepnei b'chinas habitl shabbat, due to the bitl. So a student that is a clay reikon, an empty container, ready to absorb what the teacher is teaching, is the perfect keli. That's Malchus. If the student is a student, but he's not listening, or he's arrogant, or something else doesn't allow him to really absorb because he gets in the way, he's not going to be appropriate keli. So Malchus, on one hand, is a keli, makabel, but it's and has nothing of its own. But at the same time, it has the proper bittel that it does have. It has bittel that allows it to absorb that which comes from a higher place. And that's why Malchus is referred to earth, to land. The Medrash says, Eretz, everybody steps on it. It's similar to what we say in Shemoneh Esrei, Nafshi la my spirit is like offer, like earth, like dust before everyone. It's a humility. Everyone steps on it. Now here it can be used in a negative way, that the earth is a lowly thing, that everyone just tramples on it and walks all over it. But it also can be referred to a level of deep bittul, because it allows everyone to walk on it. The earth has the humility that it can be essentially the platform upon which everybody walks. Doshin Allah. Dahainu b'chinas habitl. And here he's referring to it obviously in a positive way, that it's a state of bittul. Shamayim is a level of giluyim. We don't walk on the sky. We don't walk on heaven. We don't walk on air, so to speak. But we walk on the earth, because the earth is Malchus, which is a level of a keli of bittul. The Nikra Keish Yeshuis, continuing to explain Malchus. Malchus is also called Keish Yeshuis, the cup of salvation. Keish Yeshuis Esa, we say. Lift the cup of salvations. Why is it called a kos? Shikeli lekabel b'chinas chsadim elyenim. That's why it's called a kos. It's not just a blessing. It's a container for a blessing. It's a kos because it has the bittul, like a cup, like a container, like a kos, a becher, a goblet, to receive the higher chsadim, the kindness from above, which is the brachas of Yeshua's. And it continues. Now he's going to the Ma'ir Eir, the same Sefer, Ma'ir Eir, but now he's talking letter Chaf, apparently the word kos, cup. So he says, Eis Chaf, Sif Lamed Zayin, section 37, where he talks about what is the cup in Kabbalah. Klei Nikra HaYesod de Nukva. Or maybe it's the Erech Keli, maybe not kos, I'm not sure. But it looks like Keli Nikra HaYesod de Nukva. It's Malchus, but the Yesod of Malchus. So the Yesod of Malchus is the container. V'hu b'chinas klei reikon. And that's, as I mentioned before, the empty container. A container that's not empty is not going to receive. It's not going to draw, it's not going to absorb. So you need to have here on one hand an empty container, but with bittul, that it needs to be a makabel, but it has the keli reikon, the keli to draw down the energy from above. All this is explaining why it's a psila. Remember, psila, a wick, has to be exactly the same thing. You have to have something there, but that something has to be completely absorbing and drawing the shemen, the fuel, and allowing the flame to hold on to it. If the keli of the psila would have too much of its own identity, and it wouldn't be, wouldn't have bittul, it would not be a proper container to let a flame burn. And like he discusses this in the Maimon Leitia Mishakela, which interestingly was mentioned earlier, a lot earlier. The Maimon Leitia Mishakela. The top of the right page, I think it was right here. Yeah. Okay, so that's all about the bittul. Good. That's much earlier than I thought. Okay. I'll look it up later. Leitia Mishakela is a mimer of Teda Er Mishpatim. That's most likely the one he's referring to. Yadua, and the parentheses continues. Yadua, and it's known, the B'chinas Malchus, B'chinas Makabel, V'gam B'chinas Mashpia. Now he's adding another piece. It's known that Malchus has two elements to it. Element of being a recipient, but also element of being a Mashpia, a giver, a transmitter. Shezeh inyan v'amuna kol zeis, Lashon Nukva, V'kayim aleinu Lashon Zocher. So we say, Amuna kol zeis, zeis is in the feminine. The Amuna of all this, V'kayim aleinu. And it preserves, and V'kayim, and it's sustained upon us. V'kayim aleinu, it should have said kayemes, if it's Lashon Akeva. So how do you have it both feminine and masculine? So the answer is because on one hand, Malchus receives, like the moon, from the sun, that's a makabel. But then because it receives, it can now be mashpia to the lower levels, because it's a perfect conduit, like a kos. When the kos receives the wine or the liquid that's within it, the blessings within it, you then can pour the wine and the blessings to somebody else. So if you weren't a makabel, it couldn't be a mashpia. So Malchus ends up being both. And they're interdependent. So like the psila, again, like the wick, on one end, it's receiving and it's absorbing properly the fuel, and that's why it can be a keli that the flame holds on to it and burns and gives off light and warmth and everything a flame accomplishes. So the psila is in that sense, that type of interface. So we said so far, it's Malchus, it's Shechina, comes down below, Tachtenim. It's the level of makabel, but it's a level of kabel that has bittul, kos, keli, and now both mashpia, makabel and mashpia. Valkein nikle b'shem psila, and that's why it's called the name of by the name wick, a wick, shibchinas makabel, because it's a state of receptive state, a recipient. Shemakabelas ha'sa'ir, it receives and absorbs the fire, the flame. And causes it to burn below. If you didn't have the wick, the flame wouldn't burn. The flame would expire. It would go upward. It would just disappear. It would be consumed, or it would disappear. And here it allows it to shine. The kafia mavur kan. And now he's bringing it back to what we're discussing here at the top of page 1351. Now, because according to what explaining here, that the light refines and it causes the shemen, the fuel, which on its own is in a potential state, it brings it alive. So in the nimshal here, in the moral, he's saying that besides the fact that it's shining a flame, it's also taking the shemen and it's refining it and causing it to radiate. And that's what the psila does. it serves as an interface between the fuel and the fire. So you take away the psila, the fuel is here and the fire is here. The fuel is right. The psila connects the two. And this is what he concludes. This is the parentheses. I'll just read on. So we have the end of the phrase. What was the whole thing began with? That the three elements of a fire, of a candle, wick, shemen, oil, fuel, and fire and light, that the psila is the keli, is the nefesh alekis. So now he concludes, so too the soul that manifests in the body, he b'chinas psila. That's why the neshama is called neir, because the soul, as it manifests in the body, that's the level of the wick. So before he called the nefesh alekis, but clearly he's spelling out now as it comes and manifests inside of a body. Just want to see here where I'm going to stop here. I think we should stop here, actually. Stop anyway. Yeah, we're going to stop here. He's going to bring more proof to explain, to make a case for this. And then he's going to explain there's two other things in the soul. There's the flame and there's the fuel. But right now, the psila is the neshama as it manifests in the body, is that state that he says that draws down the flame, the fire below, and uses the fuel to feed that fire. But we'll soon learn what those other two things are. We'll learn that in the next few classes. So I'm going to stop here on top of page 1351. Anybody have any questions? So to sum up, what we've learned here is a bunch of questions on two main questions. What is, when you say ner mitzvah, why ner, and ner neshama, ner Hashem nishma sadam, what is a flame, which he's now explaining a candle. And then he went to the other question, which is, we find Torah and neshamas are both compared to the word Adam. They both connected to Adam. What's the difference between the tzir, the image of Adam? God is on his own, is beyond it all, beyond structure, beyond image. What's the difference between the tzir of Adam in neshama and tzir Adam, the structure of Adam, a man in Torah, which he said we'll understand after we understand the Indian of ner mitzvah and ner neshamis, which is what we're middle of learning right now. So we'll stop here, close to the top of page 1351. Any question, please? Okay. If there are no questions, we'll stop the recording here. Second line on page 13.